Welcome to my review of Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith for the Game Boy Advance. And this game actually came out for a few platforms, but I believe it's based on the one that came out on PS2 and the original Xbox. It seems to be based on that version, which it's a very different game because of the platform it's on. It's actually a completely different game than the one on Xbox and PS2. And it's a much better game than that version. The one on Xbox and PS2 was pretty much identical on both platforms, but this one is a unique version, and it is a 2D beat 'em up instead of a 3D action type of game that the other version was. So, as I said, it took me around 2 hours 56 minutes to beat, but if you play through without fucking up, it takes about 2 hours. So it's about 2 hours of gameplay. You know, if you were to play perfectly your first time, which would be very hard to do, but that is the length of the actual game. So yeah, it's actually the game has quite a few different moves. There's a lot of varied moves. The boss fights are pretty cool, though. The boss fights do get recycled pretty heavily, where they're really similar to the way you fight some of the humanoid type of bosses and a few of the machines. So that is one downside of the game, you know, that it does recycle some of the bosses to where they're really similar. So a little bit more variety would be better. But there's a decent amount of different boss fights. And there's a decent amount of enemy variety too. Not a huge amount, but enough to make things interesting when they're all mixed together. You have escape sequences like this where sometimes you just have to escape an area before the timer runs out. So there's a nice variety of different gameplay. There's actually a DS version of this game that has some flight sequences, I believe, that this game doesn't have. So that version adds a few different scenarios, but I don't think it adds much else than that. But it might be worth checking out on the DS as well. I still have yet to play that version, and I'll probably beat that version as well. But yeah, you have a nice variety of enemies. You have some power moves. You have different moves that you unlock, things that you upgrade, like your saber throw. You have different force powers, you know, like the saber throw, I think, is one of them. And there's a decent amount of different force powers that you can unlock, and special moves, like power moves. There's a screen clearing type of move that will either clear the screen or do massive damage to bosses, so that's a good move. You have a nice variety of different moves. Your blue meter below your health bar is your force meter. So that's for your force moves, and you can replenish that as you go through the stages and pick up certain items. I think it may recharge on its own too. You can also deflect lasers and things like that, which sometimes you have to do to beat some bosses. You have to deflect the lasers back, like this guy. And this is a fight that seems to be repeated at least 2 or 3 times. You know, they may add a little bit to it, but it's very similar. But it's a cool fight. You do get multiple lives, so as you can see, you have about 2 or 3 lives. Sometimes you can get a 1-up, so that helps. If you lose all your lives, you're going to be sent back to the last checkpoint. Sometimes you have to redo a whole stage. Other times it's like a mid-stage checkpoint, but you do have saves and unlimited continues at least. The game has a pretty good blocking system where you have to block either up or down to deflect certain attacks, and then you can counter the bosses. You mainly only use that on some of the humans that have lightsabers, mainly bosses. You can also use it on some of the human enemies. But usually you can spam some simple moves and you don't have to do all that complicated blocking type of shit on the human enemies. You know, saber throw works great on the human enemies. If you just throw the saber at them, it can kind of knock them out pretty fast. I don't think I figured that out at this point. But you have quite a few different moves. And, you know, the areas are good. The soundtrack is quite good. It's a little bit similar to the Super Nintendo Super Star Wars games, the soundtrack, but it's definitely quite a bit worse. It's not quite on that level of quality, but it's not that far off. So now we have some more different enemies. Now, towards this portion of the game, you know, this is late game. The last few stages, you pretty much have to beat the whole stage, or you have to get all the way up to the boss of the stage to get the checkpoint. So the last few areas are where the game gets pretty tough. Nothing insane, but the game does get challenging near the end. But before that, it's pretty damn easy, you know, moderate to easy. But as you get to the last few stages, they force you to do a lot. and they throw a lot more enemies at you and more difficult sequences and things like that. So I show some of that here. I may show this full stage just to give you an idea of some of the harder parts. So that's the rage force power that I'm using, and that gives you extra damage for a short period of time. That uses up some of your force bar. You're going to have to sometimes escape shit and jump some obstacles and things like that. So it does mix it up. The main idea here is to clear out all the enemies, and then the machine will chase you again. And then you'll have to navigate these obstacles and get to the next area that's kind of like a trigger point for the next group of enemies. And you cannot proceed until you clear out the enemies, and then the boss will chase you again. So it just repeats for a while, but they throw some hard enemies at you, some hard combinations of enemies, and it can start to wear down your health meter and get pretty tough. This section took me some tries. But yeah, you'll start to see a good amount of the enemy variety at this point. By this point in the game, they're throwing a pretty big variety of enemies at you, which is good. You have some pickups, like I said. Sometimes you can pick up some health. Like those orange things are health, and then I think the green things might be force. So you can get some of your force bar back. Actually, I see it doesn't regenerate your force bar, but you can get pickups. You get them pretty often to regenerate some of your force, So this part, of course, you got to try to take these enemies out while the boss is constantly firing on you. So it can be a little tricky, because you may get stuck in an animation that you can't cancel out of. But there's a lot of, good action scenes in the game. It plays very well. I was impressed with the game initially. I thought it was quite good. Some of my issues might be that the game recycles a lot of bosses, and for a game with RPG type of mechanics and upgrades, it feels like it should be a longer game, Not that 2 hours is short for a beat 'em up, but, you don't get to really upgrade a lot of your shit to max, But I think there may be a New Game Plus mode where you can play on a harder difficulty, maybe with your current upgrades from your previous playthrough. I think, but I didn't actually try it, so I'm not going to say for certain. I'm just basing my review off of what I played, which was basically just the main campaign. I just went through the game once. But you can see this checkpoint goes on for quite a while, so you do have to manage your health. All of this is still, not the next checkpoint. You have to make it to the boss of the stage to get the checkpoint. So this was one of the tougher stages. You see that move I just did is a screen clearing move. It pretty much wipes out any normal enemies on screen, and I think it does decent damage to bosses. Though I'm not sure about the boss part, because bosses may block that, actually, but it is good to use as a screen clearing. A good move to use on bosses is your rage ability, because you'll get increased boss damage when you hit the bosses with your sword. But a boss like this where you're deflecting lasers, I don't think the rage force power will help at all, because I think the only way you can damage this is by throwing the grenades back at the boss or deflecting the lasers. So this is one of the trickier boss fights, since you have to manage quite a bit. Between throwing the bombs back and deflecting the lasers and all the enemies and everything, it can be a little tricky. This is a checkpoint, though. If you make it to this boss, at least you don't have to redo that stage anymore. So you get a checkpoint here, and even if you waste all your lives and continue, you'll get to start at the boss. So you get a few lives to try to take this boss down, so it's not too bad. But it's tricky. It's easy to get knocked around by the bombs. Especially because while you're trying to deflect the bombs back, the boss is trying to home in on you and lock in on you with that laser on the ground. So it makes it a little tricky. Deflecting the lasers is pretty easy with a little bit of mashing. It's really not too hard to do, but throwing the bombs back is tricky since the boss is constantly targeting you. The animations take a while and you can't really cancel out of them, so while you're trying to throw the bombs back, it's easy to get hit. You don't have a lot of time to do it before the boss locks in on you. So now when this guy comes out, I think this is what they add to this boss fight. It's the same boss fight, but now a little metal man comes out of the top. So now you just got to deflect some lasers back at him. So, you know, they try to like just add a little bit of extra to the boss. And of course you have to throw the bombs back as well in this version. So they make it like a harder version of a previous boss fight. And the human boss fights are all very similar attacks as well, like when you're fighting the lightsaber guys, you know, the human type of bosses. So, like I said, a lot of recycled boss shit. You can get some power-ups out of these panels up there, so that's kind of useful. So this is the other difficult section of the game. I think this is the only other section that gave me a decent amount of trouble. This is another very long checkpoint. So I'll show this in its entirety so you can get an idea. You can also see maybe some of the newer moves that I might be using by this point. I think I was using saber throws more by this point. I understood that they were really good. You can upgrade the power of your various force moves, and you can also upgrade your health bar, your attack, or your force bar. So, you know, there's two different types of upgrades, basically. You can upgrade your force powers, or you can upgrade either, you know, health, force, or your damage output with your lightsaber, I believe. I mostly went for attack power, because I'd rather go for offensive upgrades than more health most of the time. I like to take shit out faster and be done with it, because I'm not trying to take a lot of damage. So these shield guys are easy enough. You can also, I think you can take their shield down, similar to what you do in the Xbox and PS2 versions, by using your force stun. I believe may work on them, if I remember right. It's been a little while. I beat this maybe a few weeks ago. But this checkpoint can be pretty challenging. It still goes on for quite a bit. But yeah, quite a good game. Like I said, I was impressed with the overall combat feel of the game. Felt very good. Maybe that's the end of it, unless I just edited it down. But by this point now you're on the final boss, which is pretty much the same kind of lightsaber duels you've already done with these enemies, these bosses, but it's like two phases. And he doesn't really have that many different moves from which you've dealt with. So it might be a little bit switched up, but it's pretty easy once you learn what to block and how to counter everything. It's really not bad. But it's a fun fight. But again, the last boss is a little bit too similar to all the other humanoid bosses you fought. So not a hell of a lot of variety, but still kind of fun. It's still a hell of a lot better than the PS2 and Xbox version of this game, which was an okay game. But this is actually like a top-tier beat-em-up for the Game Boy Advance. Definitely no Double Dragon Advance, which is one of my favorite beat-em-ups of all time. But for the Game Boy Advance, this is definitely one of the better beat-em-up type of games for that system. So I don't know if I would really call it just a beat-em-up, because there is some platforming and stuff in there. But quite a good game. Definitely one I would recommend. But of course, you know, because of some of the issues I had with it, of not being like, you know, as long as it could have been for a game with RPG mechanics, it feels like it should be longer, and it would be better with less recycled content, like I said. But the stages are all pretty well paced and enjoyable. I enjoyed it most of the way through. So for me, it's a 7.5 out of 10. It's quite a good game, and you know, it could be elevated even to an 8 or, you know, great level of game, depending on, you know, what you think of the game. I mean, because it does have some replay. You see that this little message at the end tells you about master difficulty, and I'm guessing you can carry your upgrades over New Game Plus style, but I'm just guessing. If you have any questions, let me know, and thanks for watching.